December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The fog of war is not a metaphor here. It is a cold, wet shroud that clings to the foxholes ringing the Belgian town of Bastogne. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Easy Company, and the scattered, shattered remnants of Combat Command B, this isn't war. It's a frozen nightmare. They are surrounded, outnumbered 5-1, low on ammunition, low on food, and desperately low on hope. The German armor is everywhere. The sound of their engines is a constant, grinding threat that lives in the trees just beyond the fog. Every rumble of a Panzer IV, every high-pitched whine of a Panther's turret is a promise of death. The orders are simple. Hold the town. But how do you hold against steel with frozen rifles and empty stomachs? The German commander demands surrender. The American general, Anthony McAuliffe, gives a one-word reply that will become legend. Nuts. A moment of bravado. But bravado doesn't stop a 50-ton tank. The 500 men holding the perimeter near the village of Noville are about to be erased from the map. They are staring at the end. But in that frozen hell, one man, a sergeant from the 40th Tank Battalion, sees something no one else does. He isn't looking at the enemy tanks, he's listening to them. And in that sound, he forms an idea. A desperate, impossible, crazy idea. A trick, a bluff so insane that it just might work. A gamble that will risk his own life to save 500. The world had shrunk to the size of a snow-filled foxhole. It was a shallow grave scraped from the frozen earth, smelling of pine needles, gunpowder, and fear. For the men of the 101st Airborne and the tankers of Combat Command B dug in around Bastogne, life was measured in the sharp crack of a distant 88mm shell and the agonizingly slow creep of frostbite. The cold was a living entity. It didn't just bite, it consumed. It crawled under their wet wool uniforms, seeped into their boots, and turned their feet into numb, useless blocks of ice. Men forgot what it felt like to be warm. They forgot what silence sounded like. The air itself was a weapon, brittle and sharp, carrying the metallic cough of a German MG-42 from somewhere deep in the impenetrable white fog. The fog was their jailer. It hid the panzers, it muffled the screams, and it swallowed the sun. This was the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble, and Bastogne was the crossroads that had to be held. The town was a critical junction. If it fell, the German offensive could split the Allied lines wide open. General McAuliffe knew it. The Germans knew it. And every frozen GI clinging to the perimeter knew it. But knowing didn't make the artillery shells land any softer. It didn't put more K-rations in their empty stomachs. It didn't bring back the medics cut down trying to drag a wounded man from the open. The situation was beyond desperate. It was statistical annihilation. The paratroopers were heroes, but they were infantry. They had no heavy armor, only a few tank destroyers and light tanks from the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions that had been caught in the pocket with them. They were lions, facing a tide of steel. In the command post, a damp cellar smelling of mold and unwashed bodies, the reports were grim. Radio messages crackled with mounting panic. "Sector 4, overrun! Heavy armor! We're falling back!" But there was nowhere left to fall back to. Bastogne was the end of the line. The Germans had been probing, testing, finding the weak points. Now they were bringing up the main event,
A massive column of Panther and Panzer IV tanks, supported by waves of Panzer grenadiers in white snow camouflage, was grinding its way toward the thin line held near Noville. This was the killing blow. 500 men, mostly from the 1st Battalion of the 506th Paratrooper Infantry Regiment, stared into the fog, waiting for it. They checked their M1 Garands, the metal so cold it burned their bare skin. They counted their bazooka rounds, 2, maybe 3 per squad, useless against the frontal armor of a Panther. Among the scattered units was Sergeant Clarence E. Wolter. He wasn't airborne. He was a tanker, a part of Team de Sobry from the 10th Armored Division, which had been battered and bruised in the initial onslaught. Wolter was a mechanic as much as a soldier, a man who understood tanks not as abstract symbols of power, but as loud, fickle, oil-thirsty beasts. He knew their smells, their sounds, their vulnerabilities. His own tank was gone, knocked out in the chaotic fighting days earlier. Now he was just another rifleman in a ditch, his tanker's jacket offering little protection against the sub-zero wind. He was cold, he was hungry, and he was watching his war end. He listened. The ground was vibrating. It wasn't the sporadic rumble of a single scouting vehicle. This was a low seismic hum, the sound of dozens of engines, dozens of steel treads churning the frozen Belgian soil. It was the sound of an avalanche. Wolter closed his eyes, filtering out the sporadic rifle fire, the shouting, the chatter of his own teeth. He focused only on the sound. He could hear the distinct, throaty roar of the Maybach engines. He could hear the high-pitched squeal of their suspensions. He could even hear the rhythm of their advance. They weren't charging. They were methodical, cautious. The fog made them wary too. They didn't know exactly where the American line was or what it had. They were assuming, as any sane commander would, that the Americans had something to stop them. Anti-tank guns, other tanks, a minefield. They were probing, moving, then stopping to listen. Moving, stopping, listening. It was this rhythm, this caution, that sparked the first flicker of an idea, a thought so audacious it bordered on suicidal. He crawled over to a lieutenant, a young paratrooper whose face was a mask of gray exhaustion. "Lieutenant," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "those Panzers, they're nervous." The lieutenant just stared at him. "We're all nervous, Sergeant." Wolter shook his head, the frost on his helmet crunching. "No, sir, I mean they are. They're blind in this fog. They're stopping every few hundred yards to listen for us." The lieutenant frowned. "So?" The sound of the engines grew louder, closer. A shell whistled overhead and exploded somewhere in the town behind them, showering the snow with frozen dirt. Wolter pointed not into the fog, but to a crippled American M18 Hellcat tank destroyer sitting abandoned in a shallow ditch nearby. It had been hit 2 days ago. Its crew was dead. Its gun was useless, breech damaged. It was just 20 tons of cold steel. "We ain't got any armor, right?" Wolter asked. The lieutenant nodded grimly. "Just us." Wolter's eyes gleamed with a strange feral light. "The Germans don't know that." The idea was forming, crystallizing in the frozen air. It was a bluff, a ghost story. But to tell it, he would need to get to that tank destroyer. He would need a battery, a working radio, and he would need to become the bait. He looked at the lieutenant. "Can you get me a working battery from a jeep and a radio? And can your men give me covering fire?" The lieutenant was confused. "Covering fire for what? It's a dead tank, Sergeant. You'll die for nothing." Wolter tapped his temple. "It's dead, but it doesn't sound
urgent
dead."
whispers. The Germans were listening. They were afraid of American tank destroyers, the TDs, whose high-velocity guns could punch through their armor. What if, in the fog, they heard one? What if they heard one starting up, moving, hunting them? They couldn't see it.
All they had was the sound. The German advance was slow, methodical. It relied on infantry support. If the tanks believed a predator was stalking them in the mist, they would stop. They would halt their infantry. They would wait for the fog to lift or for their own anti-tank guns to come up. They would pause. And a pause, even for an hour, might be enough time for the weather to break, for supplies to come, for something to change. It was a flicker of hope in an ocean of darkness. The lieutenant stared at him for a long moment. The ground shook. The panzers were closer, maybe 800 yards. He could hear the clatter of individual treads. It was madness. It was suicide. But it was also the only plan they had. "Get him the damn battery!" the lieutenant barked at a nearby corporal. 2 men scrambled back toward a ruined jeep, bullets snapping over their heads. Wolter grabbed his M3 grease gun. "Sir," he said, "tell your men to fire at nothing." The lieutenant blinked. "What?" Wolter chambered around. "When I get in that tank, tell your men to start firing. At the fog, at the trees, at ghosts. Make it sound like they're protecting something. Make it sound like they're supporting me." He was no longer a cold, scared infantryman. He was a tanker again, and he was hunting. He crawled out of the foxhole, the battery in a sack, and began the long, agonizing crawl across 50 yards of open, snow-covered ground toward the dead Hellcat. Every German machine gunner in the woods was listening for a target, and Sergeant Wolter was about to make a whole lot of noise.
The 50 yards from the foxhole to the tank destroyer was a frozen eternity. Each yard was a lifetime. Sergeant Wolter moved in a low, agonizing crawl, dragging the heavy jeep battery behind him. The snow was not soft. It was a crust of ice over a powdery base, and every movement seemed to echo in the dead-still air. He was a dark shape against a white background, a perfect target. He kept his face pressed into the snow, tasting the bitter cold, the grit of the earth. His lungs burned. Every breath was a betraying cloud of white vapor, and he tried to exhale into the snow to smother the steam. Above him, the fog swirled, a dirty ceiling that muffled the world. The only clear sound was the snap-crackle of rifle fire from the German lines, sporadic and searching. They were firing at phantoms, at the sounds of the paratroopers digging in deeper. Or maybe they had seen him. Maybe a finger was tightening on a trigger right now. He didn't pray. He counted. 1 crawl, breathe. 2 crawls, breathe. He was a mechanic. This was a job. Get the part to the machine. The part was a 20-pound battery. The machine was a dead tank. And the job was to raise the dead. He passed the dark, frozen shape of a fallen paratrooper, his helmet askew, a dusting of snow already collecting on his uniform. Wolter averted his eyes. He couldn't afford that. He couldn't afford pity or fear or anything but the mission. His fingers, even in their wool gloves, were wooden. He felt the sharp, stinging pain that came just before true numbness. Almost there. He reached the steel flank of the M18 Hellcat. It was like touching a block of ice. The metal was so cold it felt like it was burning him. A bullet pinged off the hull, inches from his head. The sound was sharp, terrifyingly loud, like a hammer striking an anvil. He didn't flinch. He just pressed himself flat against the tank's tread, waiting for the follow-up burst. It didn't come. Just the wind and the distant, grinding rumble of the enemy. The panzers were still moving, still closing. He had seconds, maybe minutes. He slid along the side of the hull, hidden from the front, and reached for the crew hatch. It was slightly ajar. He pulled. It was frozen shut, sealed with ice. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He couldn't get in.
He slammed his grease gun against the gap, trying to break the seal. The metal-on-metal clang was deafening. Stupid, stupid, stupid! He stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited. Silence. He had just announced his position to the entire German army. But the fog held. The fog was his only ally. He took a breath, wedged the butt of his gun into the gap, and leaned, putting every ounce of his weight into it. There was a sickening crack of ice, and the hatch groaned open an inch. It was enough. He slid his numb fingers inside and pulled. The stench hit him first, a close metallic smell of old oil, burned gunpowder, and the faint sweet-sour odor of death. The crew had been removed, but their memory lingered. He slid into the commander's seat, dragging the heavy battery in after him, and pulled the hatch closed. The thud of the heavy steel locking him in was the most profound silence he had ever known. The world vanished. The wind, the fog, the rifle fire, all of it was gone, replaced by a dull metallic ringing in his ears. He was in a cold, dark, steel box. He was blind. His breath fogged instantly in the tiny space. He could see nothing. He fumbled for his lighter, his hand shaking violently now, not just from cold, but from adrenaline. The tiny flame sparked, failed, sparked again. It cast a weak, flickering glow over the compartment. The interior was pristine, untouched by the shell that had disabled it. Wires, dials, steel. He found the internal battery compartment. It was empty. The original crew, or perhaps salvagers, had taken it. Good. Less to disconnect. Now the hard part. He had to wire the Jeep battery to the tank's main ignition and radio circuits. He pulled off his gloves, his bare skin instantly stinging as it touched the frozen metal. He fumbled with the wires. His fingers were numb, clumsy, useless. Don't drop the screw. Don't cross the wires. He was whispering to himself, his voice a dry rasp. Come on, baby, just give me the juice. He worked by the tiny flicker of his lighter, the flame guttering, threatening to die and leave him in absolute darkness. He attached the positive cable, a small blue spark. He attached the negative, nothing. He jiggled the connection, still nothing. His heart sank. It was all for nothing. The battery was a dud. The cold had killed it. Then a low hum. A single gauge light on the dashboard flickered, a dim, hopeful green. The radio crackled to life with a burst of static that made him jump. It was working. He hadn't just wired the ignition, he had wired the entire electrical system. He took a breath. This was it. He put his foot on the clutch, frozen solid. He stomped on it, the impact jarring his whole body. It broke free with a groan. He grabbed the starter. He didn't turn it. He just sat there, listening. The German panzers. He could feel them through the hull, a low, deep vibration that was coming closer. They hadn't stopped. His climb, his wiring, it had all been too slow. They were coming. He was a dead man in a steel coffin. It was then that the American line erupted. The lieutenant had kept his word. A sudden, chaotic wall of sound. M1 Garands firing as fast as men could pull the trigger. Bars ripping through the fog. The pounding thump, thump, thump of a .50 caliber machine gun. It was glorious, terrifying noise, and it wasn't firing at the panzers. It was firing over them, into the woods, into the fog. It was the sound of a perimeter defending its heavy armor. It was his cue. Wolter slammed his thumb on the starter. The sound was apocalyptic. The Hellcat starter whined, a high-pitched scream that cut through the fog like a knife. The engine sputtered, coughed, caught. The right Continental engine roared to life, a deep, throaty vroom that shook the very ground. The entire tank vibrated, the deck plates rattling under his feet. In the tiny, enclosed space, the noise was physical. It was a punch in the chest. It was the sound of 700 horsepower waking from the dead. He grabbed the turret traverse, praying the hydraulics still had fluid. He hit the switch. With a hydraulic whine and a grinding of gears, the long 76mm cannon, the dead, useless cannon, began to turn. It moved slowly, painfully, but it moved. It was a ghost
Outside,
turning its head
the effect
in the
was
fog.
instantaneous. The sound of the German tank engines changed. The deep, steady rumble of their advance faltered. Wolter could hear it. They were stopping. One by one, the rhythm of their engines shifted from a cruising roar to a high-strung idle. Then, silence. A new kind of silence. The Panzers had stopped. He could picture it perfectly. A German commander in his cupola, binoculars useless, peering into the white. He had just heard a Hellcat, the most feared tank destroyer in the American arsenal, start its engine inside the American line. He had heard it traverse its turret. He had heard the supporting infantry fire. He was blind, and a predator was waiting. The German doctrine was clear. Do not advance blind into a prepared anti-tank ambush. Wolter grinned, a frantic, terrified grimace in the dark. He revved the engine. Vroom, vroom, vroom. He made it sound eager, angry. He traversed the turret back the other way. Grind, whine. He was painting a picture with sound. I'm here. I see you. Come and get me. He grabbed the radio handset. He switched it to the frequency he knew the Germans monitored. He didn't say anything in code. He just pressed the transmit button. Charlie 1, this is Hunter. I've got him in sight. Target, a whole mess of 'em. On my mark. Fire for effect. It was nonsense. Charlie 1 didn't exist. He had no gun. He couldn't see a thing. But the Germans could hear him. They could hear an American tanker, confident, ready, calling in an artillery strike on their exact position. A single 88mm shell screamed past. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched shriek followed by a crack boom that shook the Hellcat, throwing Wolter against the steel sight. They were firing blind, firing at him, at the sound. He revved the engine again, a defiant roar. Come on, you bastards. He was the bait. He was the ghost. He was the lone crazy tanker in a dead machine, holding back an entire panzer column with nothing but a battery and a bluff. The seconds stretched into minutes. The German engines idled. They did not advance. The artillery stopped. There was only the sound of his own engine, the frantic American rifle fire, and the deep, frustrated hum of 50 German tanks, paralyzed by a threat that did not exist. The bluff was holding. But the sun would eventually rise. The fog would eventually lift, and Sergeant Wolter was trapped in the very thing saving his comrades. He was a ghost in a steel coffin, and the hunters were waiting for the dawn.
The inside of the Hellcat was a symphony of chaos. The roar of the 700 horsepower engine, trapped and amplified within the small steel compartment, was a physical weight. It wasn't just sound, it was a vibration that shook Wolter's teeth, rattled his bones, and threatened to tear the tank apart. His initial burst of adrenaline, the wild, desperate courage of the attack, was already fading, replaced by a new, colder, more profound terror. The terror of the weight.
He was a lone man in a steel box, blind to the world, anchored in a sea of fog, and he had just screamed his exact location to a pack of wolves. The air grew thick, stinging his eyes. The smell of rich, unburnt gasoline and hot metal filled his lungs. The engine was cold-blooded, and it was running rich, fouling the air he breathed. He was a target. Every second the engine ran, he was a beacon. He could feel the German panzers out there. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. A low-frequency vibration through the frozen earth, a counter-rhythm to his own engine's roar. They were still idling, not advancing, not retreating, just waiting, listening. He could picture the German commanders huddled over their own maps, listening to this lone, defiant American tank. They were confused. This made no sense. A single tank destroyer, unsupported? It was a trap. It had to be a trap. The paratroopers' rifle fire, which sounded distant and muffled through the steel hull, was the perfect chorus to his deception. It sounded exactly like infantry protecting their armored support. How long? The thought hammered at him. How long can this last? An hour? 10 minutes? The fog was his shield, his collaborator, but it wouldn't last forever. The weak gray light pressing at the vision slits told him dawn was coming, and when the fog burned off, when the sun rose, they would see him. They would see one solitary, disabled tank destroyer. The bluff would shatter, and the wave would crash. He had to keep the illusion alive. He couldn't just sit here and make noise. A real tanker would be hunting. He had to give them a performance. He grabbed the turret traverse again, the cold metal biting into his bare hands. He hit the switch. The hydraulic whine screamed and the useless gun swung, grinding over their heads. He stopped it abruptly, as if he had acquired a target. Then he did the craziest thing yet. He slammed the gear shift into first. The clang of the transmission engaging echoed in the hull. He stomped on the throttle, a sharp, angry vroom, then let off, then stomped again. He rocked the tank, lurching it forward and back on its suspension, making the entire chassis groan and squeal. He wasn't moving. The treads were probably frozen solid in the ditch, but to anyone outside, blind in the fog, it would sound like a tank lurching forward, repositioning, jockeying for a firing angle. It was the sound of aggression. It was the sound of a predator getting ready to pounce. He grabbed the radio handset, his knuckles white. "Hunter, to all units, I'm moving up. I'm going in. Cover me! Cover me!" The response was immediate and terrifying. It wasn't rifle fire. It was the sound of a high-velocity shell ripping the air apart, the shriek of an 88. It was closer, much closer than the last one. The shell struck the ground 20 yards in front of the Hellcat. The boom was a physical blow. The concussion wave slammed into the tank, making the steel hull ring like a massive bell. Wolter was thrown forward, his forehead cracking hard against the cold steel of the gunner's sight. Pain, sharp and electric, exploded behind his eyes. He fell back into the commander's seat, his vision swimming in the dim green glow of the instrument panel. He tasted something warm and metallic in his mouth. Blood. The smell of exhaust was suddenly overpowering, acrid. Was the engine hit? Was the hull breached? He fought down the panic, forcing his blurred vision to focus. The engine was still running. The hull was intact. But the world outside had changed. The Germans weren't just confused anymore. They were angry. They were scared. And they were trying to kill the sound. Another 88 shell screamed in, this one landing behind him, showering the rear deck with frozen dirt and shrapnel that pinged and tinked against the armor. They were bracketing him. They were using sound to find him, just as he was using sound to fool them. They were firing blind, but they wouldn't be blind long. From the American line, he heard a shout, faint but clear through the lull in the wind. "Give 'em hell, tanker!" The paratroopers, the 500 men, they believed in him. They thought he was real. Their morale, their very lives were tied to the sound of his engine. He had to keep it going. He revved the engine, a defiant roar in the face of the artillery. Vroom! Vroom! But this time the engine answered with a sputter, a hiccup, a moment of hesitation. His heart stopped. It caught again, roaring back to life, but the warning was clear. He looked at the dashboard, wiping the grime off a small round dial with his sleeve. The fuel gauge. The needle wasn't just low. It was buried in the red, vibrating against the empty pin. Of course. The tank was abandoned, disabled. Nobody had refueled it. He was running on fumes. He had minutes, maybe less. The bluff was working, but its lifeblood was draining away into the frozen ground.
The silence would be his confession. It would be his death warrant. The second that roar stopped, the Germans would know. They would know it was a trick. They would surge forward, and the 500 men he was trying to protect would be overrun. The silence would be their executioner. He had to bridge the gap. He had to give the men something to hold on to, even after he was gone. He needed one last final act, a performance to end the show. He grabbed the radio handset, his hand shaking so violently he could barely press the transmit button. He took a deep, ragged breath, tasting the blood and exhaust. He screamed into the mic, "Hunter to Charlie 1! I'm hit! I'm hit! They got my engine! I'm immobilized!" He revved the engine hard, making it cough and sputter. Vroom, sputter, cough. "But I see them! The fog's clearing! God, I see the whole column! They're massing! Grid 47 Alpha! They're right on top of me!" He made up the coordinates, his voice cracking with feigned panic and real terror. He saw the German panzers in his mind, lined up, ready to strike. He had to make them believe an artillery strike was coming. He had to make them stay put. "Fire on my position! Do you copy? Fire! Fire on me! For God's sake, wipe them out! Fire on me!" As if on cue, the engine gave a final, wheezing gasp. It sputtered, choked, and died. The sudden, crushing silence was absolute. It was a physical blow, heavier than any artillery shell. The vibration stopped. The green dash light flickered and went out. He was plunged into total darkness, a cold, metal tomb. His own breathing was deafening. Thump, 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 thump. His heart hammered against his ribs. He held his breath, listening. The American rifle fire, it had stopped. The paratroopers had heard his last transmission. They heard the Indian die. They thought he was a hero. They thought he was dead. And then he heard the other sound, from the fog. The German engines were still idling, the high-pitched, nervous whine. He heard shouting in German, urgent, confused. They had heard him too. They had heard the hit. They had heard the call for artillery. They were trying to decide, was it real or was this the trap? Then a new sound began, a sound that froze his blood. It was not the sound of an advance. It was the slow, cautious, metallic clank, squeak, clank of only one set of treads. One tank, moving slowly, feeling its way through the fog. It was coming toward him. They were coming to inspect the kill. The hunter was approaching the bait, and Wolter was trapped in the darkness, waiting for the hatch to open.
The silence that fell was not a silence of peace. It was a vacuum, a crushing, absolute void that sucked all life from the world. The roar of the engine had been his shield, his armor, his weapon. Now it was gone, and in its place, darkness, a cold, profound blackness that was total. Wolter sat paralyzed in the commander's seat, his own breathing suddenly, obscenely loud, a harsh, ragged gasp in, a shuddering hiss out. His heart was a trapped bird, beating against the steel cage of his ribs. He could feel the pinprick sting of the cut on his forehead, the warm, sticky trickle of his own blood tracing a line down his temple. The air was frigid, the latent heat of the engine already gone, replaced by the invasive, seeping cold of the Belgian winter. The metal of the hull, which had vibrated with life moments before, was now just a dead, cold wall. Then, the sound he had been dreading. It was quiet, almost delicate, but it cut through the silence like a scalpel. Clank. Squeak. Clank. The methodical, unhurried rhythm of a single tank tread. It was not the sound of an attack. It was the sound of a stalk, a predator, curious, approaching its trapped prey. Wolter's world shrank to that one repeating noise. It was moving slowly from the left, feeling its way through the fog, which he could sense more than see as a gray, oppressive weight beyond the vision slits. Clank. Squeak. Clank. It was closer now. He could hear the low, throaty thrum of its Maybach engine, a sound so different from his own, a German sound. He held his breath, praying the tank would pass, that it was just a scout moving to a new position. The sound stopped. The silence that returned was 1,000 times worse. The German tank wasn't passing. It had stopped right outside. It was so close, Wolter felt he could reach through the steel and touch it. He could feel the low-frequency vibration of its idling engine through the floor plates of his own Hellcat, a deep, menacing purr. He was a mouse, frozen in the dark, and the cat was just outside the hole, listening, waiting. He could picture it. A gray and white camouflaged Panzer IV, its long 75mm gun probably pointed directly at his hull. The German commander in his cupola, scanning the dead Hellcat, trying to understand, trying to see the trap. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Time had dissolved. Wolter sat rigid, his muscles locked, his body screaming to run, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. He was encased in his own tomb. His hand, numb and shaking, found the grip of his M3 grease gun. He raised it, the small, oily weapon feeling like a child's toy. He pointed it toward the hatch, a gesture of pure, desperate futility. If they opened it, he could maybe fire a single burst. It wouldn't stop them. It would only be his final, defiant word. He was going to die here, in the dark, in the cold. After all of it. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, mixing with the blood. He had saved 500 men, but he couldn't save himself. A new sound, a hard metallic scrape, on the hull, directly above him. His blood turned to ice. It was the sound of a boot, a hobnailed German boot searching for purchase on the frosted steel of his turret. Someone was climbing onto his tank. He could hear them moving, a cautious shuffling on the rear engine deck. This was no longer a battle. This was an inspection. This was intimate. He heard muffled voices, sharp and guttural, German. They were right outside. He was a rat in a box, and they were shaking it. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was kicking the turret, testing it. Then, a clang. A heavy metallic impact on his commander's hatch. They were trying to open it. He flinched so hard he struck his head again, this time on the radio set. He didn't feel the pain. He just stared up at the hatch, his grease gun shaking violently. Clang! Again, harder. A pry bar? The handle of a shovel? They were angry. They were trying to force it open.
He heard the muffled shouting clearly now. Mach auf! Raus! Open up! Get out! They knew he was in here, or they suspected. They didn't see him as a hero. They saw him as a coward hiding in a dead tank. Or perhaps they thought he was wounded, a prize to be taken. The hatch was locked from the inside, a simple steel bar. It would hold against a man. It would not hold against a machine. He heard more scrambling. The boots were off his tank now. He heard the clank-clank of a German tank hatch opening. The commander
getting
was
a cutting torch?
to his crew.
Were they going to put a grenade down the gun barrel? Then a new sound. The deep, guttural roar of the Panzer's engine as it revved. It was loud, angry. The vibration shook his Hellcat. He braced himself for the shot. He braced for the 75mm armor-piercing round that would tear through his thin steel wall and vaporize him. This was it. The end of the bluff. He closed his eyes. But the shot didn't come. Instead, there was a deafening squeal of metal on metal, a grinding of treads. The Panzer was turning. It was turning away from him. He could hear it, a massive lurching pivot in the snow. Clank, squeak, clank. The sound was growing fainter. It was leaving. He didn't dare breathe. He just listened. The Panzer was retreating, moving back into the fog from whence it came. It was going, gone. The sound vanished, swallowed by the white. But he kept listening, and he heard it. The other engines, the high-pitched whine of the idling Panther column, the low rumble of the Panzers, they were fading too. One by one, he heard them disengage, their transmissions clashing, their treads squealing as they turned. They were all pulling back. The entire column. The bluff, the final desperate radio call. It had worked. The German commander, faced with a blind advance, a dead but noisy tank, and a frantic call for artillery fire on his exact position, had made a decision. He was not willing to sacrifice his armor in a perfectly sighted American artillery trap. The fog was too thick. The risk was too high. Sergeant Wolter's one-man show had convinced an entire German battle group that they were walking into an ambush. The release was not a celebration. It was a collapse. Wolter let the grease gun fall. It clattered to the floor plates with a hollow, empty sound. He slumped forward, his forehead resting on the cold, useless gun sight, and he began to shake. It was not a shiver from the cold. It was a deep, uncontrollable, bone-jarring tremor, a storm of adrenaline and terror finally breaking. He had done it. He was alive, but he was still trapped. The silence returned, but this time it was real. No engines, no Germans, just the distant, sporadic pop of a rifle and the mournful, whistling wind. He was alone, in the dark, in his coffin. The cold which he had ignored for an hour was returning with a vengeance. It was a physical, penetrating presence. His hands were blocks of wood. His feet were gone. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, shaking in the dark. Time was a frozen river. He must have drifted, a half-conscious state of exhaustion and cold. He was jolted back by a new sound. Not a tank. Voices. Close. And they were speaking English. "I see it! There's the Hellcat, the one from the radio!" Clang, 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 a heavy, frantic banging on his hatch right above his head. "Hey, in there! You alive? Tanker, are you in there?" It was the lieutenant's voice. He tried to answer. His throat was dry, his lips cracked. I'm here. I'm stuck." He fumbled for the hatch latch, his fingers numb and useless. He couldn't grip it. Can't open it." There was a moment of silence, then the lieutenant's voice, strained. "Get a crowbar! Get him out of there! Now!" Wolter heard a grinding noise, the screech of metal on metal. They were prying the hatch. A final violent crack,
and the hatch was thrown open. A shaft of blinding, painful light stabbed into the compartment. It wasn't sunlight. It was the flat, gray, ugly light of a winter sky. The fog had thinned, lifted to a low ceiling. Strong, living hands reached into the darkness, grabbing his jacket. "We got him! He's alive! Pull!" He was dragged unceremoniously from the blackness, tumbling out onto the snow-covered deck. He fell, rolling off the tank and landing in a heap on the frozen ground. He gasped, sucking in air that was so cold it felt like swallowing glass. But it was clean. It didn't taste of fuel or gunpowder or fear. He looked up. The young paratrooper lieutenant was staring down at him, his face a perfect mask of shock, awe, and disbelief. Behind him, a dozen other GIs were peering from their foxholes, their eyes wide, looking at Wolter not as a man, but as a resurrection. I don't believe it," the lieutenant whispered, his breath pluming. "You're alive. We all thought you were—" Wolter's gaze went past him. The field was empty. The Panzers were gone. The only sign they had been there were the dark, churned-up tracks in the snow and the fresh, black craters from the 88 shells, all clustered around his tank. He tried to stand, to salute, to do something. His legs folded beneath him. The lieutenant caught him. "Easy, Sergeant, easy. You're frozen." Wolter looked at the faces of the men he had saved. He looked at the smoking, dead Hellcat. Did it work?" he chattered, his entire body shaking. The lieutenant just stared at him. "Sergeant," he said, his voice thick, "they're gone. The whole column. They're gone. You didn't just stop them. You scared them into running." Wolter nodded, a single, slow gesture. The bluff had held. The line had held. But the war was not over. And the cold was worse than ever.
Being pulled from the tank was not a rescue. It was a violent birth. Wolter collapsed into the arms of the paratroopers, his body a dead weight, his legs refusing to obey him. He was a creature hauled from the deep, his eyes blinking in the flat gray light, his lungs aching with every gasp of frigid air. The men of the 101st, men who had seen hell at Normandy, who had dropped into Holland, looked at him with a kind of bewildered reverence. He was not one of them. He was a tanker, a mechanic, but he was the man who had stared down a panzer column with nothing but a phantom. They half-carried, half-dragged him back to the relative safety of the main line, a shallow trench scraped into the earth. Someone pressed a canteen of lukewarm, metallic-tasting water to his lips. He barely tasted it. Someone else was rubbing his hands, trying to bring life back to the waxy white flesh. He felt nothing. The silence on the front was eerie. It was not peace. It was a void, a vacuum left by the sudden retreat of the German armor. The 500 men on that line were alive. They knew with a sudden, dawning clarity why they were alive. They looked from their foxholes at the solitary, smoking Hellcat, now just a piece of junk in the snow. They looked at the dark craters surrounding it, evidence of the 88s that had tried to kill the sound. And they looked at Wolter, the small, shivering man wrapped in a dirty blanket. The story passed in hushed, incredulous whispers. He started the damn thing. He faked 'em all out. Called artillery on himself. Jesus Christ! In that frozen ditch, a legend was born, the ghost of Bastogne. It was more than a tactic. It was a symbol. It was the physical embodiment of General McAuliffe's defiant, impossible
Wolter's
reply.
bluff
Did not win the Battle of the Bulge. It did not, by itself, save Bastogne. The siege would continue for another brutal week. Men would still freeze in their foxholes. The artillery would return. But what Sergeant Wolter did in that dead tank was buy the most precious commodity in war: time. He had been facing a Schwerpunkt, a German armored spearhead aimed at the weakest point in the line. Had that column of Panthers and Panzers broken through, they would have cleaved the perimeter, rolled into Bastogne, and shattered the American defense. The 500 men of the 1st Battalion would have been a mere speed bump. The entire hole in the donut defense would have collapsed. Wolter's hour-long performance, his symphony of engine noise and faked radio calls, plugged that hole. He had stopped a breakthrough with a ghost. In the German command post, miles back, the reports must have been a tapestry of confusion. A single, aggressive American tank destroyer. Heavy, well-coordinated infantry support. A sudden, frantic call for American artillery on their own position. A clear sign of a prepared, registered fire mission. The German commander, blind in the fog and haunted by the reputation of American TDs, had followed his training. You do not send your priceless armor into a prepared killing zone. He had pulled back, regrouped, and decided to wait for the fog to lift, the very fog that Wolter had used against him. By the time the fog did lift, the moment was lost. The element of surprise was gone. The Americans had redistributed their meager anti-tank assets to cover the threatened sector. The door, which had been wide open, was now shut and barred. For Wolter, the war was over, at least for a time. He was evacuated to an aid station, his feet and hands already swelling with the agonizing burning thaw of severe frostbite. He would not fire another shot in the battle. But his actions echoed. The morale of the men on that line surged. They had faced the steel tide, and a ghost had turned it back. They held their ground with a renewed, grim defiance. When, days later, the skies finally cleared and the C-47s began dropping the supplies they so desperately needed, it was a vindication. And when the first tanks of General Patton's 4th Armored Division finally broke through, the sound of their engines, real, numerous, and advancing, was the closing chord to the symphony Wolter had started. But the victory was not clean. It never is. For the 500 men who survived, the memory was burned into them. The sound of those approaching panzers, the feeling of utter hopelessness, and the sudden, impossible roar of a dead American engine. For Sergeant Clarence Wolter, the cost was a different kind of silence. For the rest of his life, he would carry the memory of that hour. He would remember the absolute, suffocating darkness, the metallic taste of his own blood, the crushing weight of the silence after the engine died, and most of all, the sound of that single German boot scraping on the steel hull right above his head. He had fooled the German army. He had saved 500 men, but he had been alone, in the dark, in a steel coffin, waiting for the end. He had learned the true meaning of holding the line. Sometimes it isn't about firepower or armor or numbers. Sometimes it's just about the audacity to make a sound when silence means death. Please like this video. Subscribe for more forgotten World War II stories. Comment where you're watching from: Texas, Germany, Australia. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.